But notice something else in this journey of change. Not only we have to hear God's call, not only have to prepare ourselves to see Him, but we have to just go home. And so it says that they got up and went home. In verse 6, Jacob and all the people went with him to Luz, which is also called Bethel, which is the house of God. And so he went. Now, there he built an altar, and he called it El Bethel. Now, El is a Hebrew word for Elohim or for God in the Old Testament. And so literally what he's saying is he called it God's house of God. God of the house of God. And this is an important truth that I think that the Scriptures is trying to teach us here this morning, that it's not a place. That he didn't just go back to a place called Bethel, the house of God. He went to the God of the house of God. He went to the person, not the place. He went to the person. You can't just go to the house. You've got to go to the God of the house, and that's what he went to, and that's who he built his altar to, and that's who he gave his worship to. And yet sometimes we try to make change by returning to a place and recreating a past. And I think if we do it like this, then God would be there. If we sung this song, God would be there. If we had this preacher lead the revival, God would be there. Or if I would do this, God would be there. No, it's not recreating a past. It's not going back to a place. It's going to the person of God, the God of the house of God, who we have to return to. I remember right after I surrendered to preach, the church I grew up in, Jeannie and I did, Concord in East Texas, they just built a new building. They had an old building that was cold and hot, and they got a new one, brick building, central heat and air, real nice brick building. It's the early 70s. Well, some of the leadership, we had this old kind of time preacher, and he said, what we need is a revival. And we're going to have us a brush arbor revival. Now, you young people don't know what a brush arbor is, but back in the early 1900s, they'd build brush arbors, and what they did was they'd cut down and go out in the woods and cut some trees down, and they'd dig some post holes, and they'd put some posts in them, and then they'd run some more trees across that, and then they'd go cut leaves off of trees and all kinds of different ones, and I'm sure people's allergies probably acted up when they put cedar and pine on top of them, but anyway, they just pile all this brush on top, and it kind of made a arbor for them, a brush arbor. And back in those days, well, they'd put sawdust down, bring in the benches, and they'd have a revival. And they'd have a real revival. God would break out in those places, and people got saved. They hit the sawdust trail, and there was conversions, and there was shoutings, there was change and transformation, and people experienced that. And my generation that was leading the church at that time thought, that's what we need to do to have revival. We need to go back and have a brush arbor. Well, we had a brush arbor, but we didn't have a revival. All we had was a bunch of mosquitoes and a lot of humidity and a lot of heat, and there was a real nice air-conditioned building right next to us. But we tried to recreate the past. And you can't recreate. You can't go back to the past. You got to go to God. That's who you got to go to. And so if there's going to be real change, it's not just recreating something in the past in our life. It's going to the God of the house of God and coming into His presence. And that's what Jacob did.